The letter had been folded for 11 years. Marion Graves knew this because she had counted the creases in the single candlelit hour she allowed herself to hold it, running her thumb along each ridge as if the paper could tell her something the ink did not. It could not. The ink had already told her everything, and everything was more than she had been prepared for when she accepted a position as archivist to the Duke of Aldenmere 6 weeks prior, hired to catalog his late father's correspondence before the old wing of the house was closed and the papers sent to a solicitor's vault. She had been hired because she was thorough, discreet, and, as Lady Constance Aldenmere had said at the interview, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, a woman who could be trusted to work quietly and without causing inconvenience. Marion had been working quietly. She had caused no inconvenience. She had found the letter on a Tuesday in a leather satchel behind a false panel in the writing cabinet, and she had read it once, and then she had sat very still for a long time in the chill of the archive room while the single candle burned down to its socket. The letter was addressed to the late Duke of Aldenmere in the handwriting of a woman named Eleanor Stowe. It was dated the 18th of October, 1813. It said, among other things, that the child was a boy, that the boy was healthy, that the boy's name was Thomas, and that Eleanor trusted the Duke would honor the arrangement they had made. It said that she asked very little. It said she asked only for silence and for the provision that had been promised. It said she understood what she was and what she could not be, and she accepted the weight of the arrangement without complaint. It said a great deal more than that. Those were the lines that had made the candle seem very small. The current Duke of Aldenmere was 34 years old. His name was Frederick Aldenmere. He was known in London as cold, precise, and largely indifferent to the social machinery that turned so industriously around him. He had inherited at 19, managed the estate with a rigor his father had never matched, and had so far declined 3 seasons' worth of candidates his mother had assembled with the diligence of a general preparing a campaign. He had a younger sister already married into Berkshire, and no other immediate family, and no one had ever suggested, not in Marion's hearing at least, that there might be a question about who he was. She folded the letter again and put it in her apron pocket. She did not sleep well. She told herself, in the weeks that followed, that she was gathering context. This was a reasonable position for an archivist. An archivist did not act on a single document. She established provenance, cross-referenced, traced the edges of what was known against the edges of what had been deliberately obscured. She returned to the writing cabinet and examined the hidden panel again. The leather of the satchel was soft with age, the brass fastening tarnished, the contents arranged with the careful tidiness of someone who had not expected anyone else to find them, but had ordered them nonetheless, as though the act of arrangement conferred a kind of dignity on what had been put away. She read through 2 more boxes of the late Duke's correspondence and found 3 further letters from Eleanor Stowe, each more careful than the last, each asking only for a confirmation that the terms of the agreement held. The first of the 3 requested acknowledgement. The second asked after the provision's continued reliability, noting quietly that her circumstances were modest and the boy's schooling was to begin in the autumn. The third asked whether the Duke might write even a single line so that she could show it to the boy someday if he asked. The final letter, dated 1815, contained a single sentence that Marion read 4 times. She asked only that the boy be told, when he was old enough, that his father had not been ashamed of him. There was no evidence that any reply had ever been sent. There was, however, evidence of the provision. 2 lines in the late Duke's private household ledger, entered in his own hand each year from 1813 to 1821, recording a payment to a T. Stowe of Wiltshire, the amounts modest, consistent, and entered without comment. The entries ceased in 1821, which was the year the late Duke had died. After that, nothing remained. The provision had died with the man who made it and had not been renewed by anyone, because no one else had known to renew it. Thomas Stowe had been 8 years old. If you have ever held a piece of paper that could unmake a man's life, you will understand why Marian's hands had not been entirely steady for 6 weeks. If you have not, take a moment to imagine it. The weight of a document that is technically ordinary, a folded letter, and some ledger entries, and yet which contains within it the entire shape of a person's history, the explanation of what they were told, and what they were not told, and what was decided for them before they were old enough to have an opinion about it. Marian had sat with that weight for 6 weeks, and she had not enjoyed a moment of the sitting, and she had arrived at the far end of it with a clarity she had not expected. She was going to tell him, not because it would be comfortable, and not because she could predict how he would receive it, and not because she had any certainty about what came next. She was going to tell him because Thomas Stowe's mother had asked only that her son be told his father was not ashamed of him, and she had asked for this across 4 careful letters, and she had received nothing, and there was a small chance, 11 years on, to give something back. This was not, she understood, her decision to make in the abstract. It was her decision to make because she was the one in the room. That was all. The archive room was in the east wing, 2 floors below the Duke's study. Marian worked there from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. And she rarely encountered the Duke, except at the twice-weekly household review when Lady Constance presided, and Marian sat at the end of the table to confirm the cataloging progress. The Duke attended these reviews punctually and left them efficiently. He had spoken to Marian directly on 4 occasions, once to ask whether the archive was dry enough for the older ledgers, once to confirm the fee arrangement, once to inquire if she required additional lamp oil, and once, in passing, on a Thursday afternoon when she had been crossing the corridor with a box of papers, to say that the work she was doing was of value to the estate. He had said it without breaking stride, in the tone of a man who says true things and does not feel the need to elaborate them, and then he had continued on toward the stables. That last one she had turned over in her mind, rather more than she expected to. Lady Constance had made her own position on Marian quite clear. Marian was the archivist. She was a gentlewoman's daughter, yes, educated and presentable enough. But she was hired help, and hired help did not linger in corridors, did not sit near windows where visitors might mistake her for a guest, and did not, under any circumstances, engage the Duke in conversation that exceeded the boundaries of her commission. Lady Constance had not said these things once. She had arranged to say them at intervals, in slightly different phrasings, as if repetition might seal them more firmly into Marian's understanding. "She is simply a very good sort of woman for this kind of work," Lady Constance had said to Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, during a household review in the 3rd week of Marian's employment, at a volume that suggested she did not mind being overheard. Quiet, capable in her limited way, one does not want anything more animated in an archive. Marian had looked down at her notes. She had been the daughter of a classical scholar, tutored alongside her brother until she was 16, able to read Latin and catalog primary sources with a fluency that most solicitors' clerks could not match. Her father had died when she was 22, leaving her a small library, a great deal of affection, and very little money. She had found her way into archive work through a succession of small commissions, each reference leading to the next, and she was good at it because she was genuinely interested in what documents said and what they withheld. She could sit with a box of letters for 8 hours and not be bored, because each letter was a small, complete world, a person making choices inside the constraints available to them, and the choices said things the words sometimes did not. She had not, until this commission encountered a document that withheld a duke. She presented herself at the door of his study on a Thursday morning in November, knocked once, and was told to enter. The study was a long room with 3 windows facing north, a fire that had been burning long enough to have produced real warmth, and shelves of estate ledgers that looked as though they were actually consulted. There was a desk with several stacks of correspondence in good order, a landscape painting of what she recognized as the north pasture, and a single armchair angled toward the fire at an angle that suggested it was used for reading rather than for receiving. The Duke was standing at the central window with a letter in his hand, and when Marian came in, he turned and waited. He was not what anyone would have called easy to read. He had dark hair, somewhat disordered as it often was in the mornings before the valet had attended him, and gray eyes that registered things with a precision that could be mistaken for coldness, and was not, Marian had come to believe, precisely that. He was tall, and wore his coat as though he had been born into the habit of it, rather than put into it, and the line of his jaw was set with a steadiness that spoke of a man who had long since decided which things required his alarm and which did not. He was looking at her now with an expression that was attentive without being impatient, and she was grateful for the attentiveness because she had not entirely known, until this moment, whether she had made the right choice in coming to him rather than to the solicitor, or to no one at all. "Miss Graves," he said. His voice was level and quiet. "Your Grace." She had not intended to pace herself so carefully, but she found she did. "I have found something in the archive that I believe must be brought to your attention directly. I have delayed in doing so because I wished to be certain of what I was looking at before I troubled you, and I believe I am now certain." He set the letter he had been holding on the desk and gave her his full attention. He did not ask her to sit, but he did not give the impression of a man who expected her to be brief, or of a man who expected her to be frightened of what she was about to say. She placed the 4 letters on the desk, in chronological order, with a short paragraph she had written in her clearest hand, summarizing the corroborating evidence she had found across the broader correspondence, the ledger entries, the dates, the amounts, the final year of payment, and the year of the late Duke's death, and the way those 2 years were the same year. She had spent 3 evenings on that paragraph. It said exactly what the evidence said, and nothing beyond it. She took 1 step back and let him read. He read for a long time. She watched the fire rather than him, which was not because she was avoiding his face, but because watching him read something this large seemed to her a trespass on a kind of privacy she had no right to. She counted the seconds between the small sounds of pages being turned. She thought about Eleanor Stowe, who had written 4 letters in a careful hand and received nothing back, and who had managed, across those 4 letters, to ask for very little and to phrase the little she asked for with a dignity that the late Duke had apparently not found sufficient reason to honor. When Frederick Aldenmuir looked up, his face was very still. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a man who has been shown the specific shape of something he had been aware of as formless for a long time, and who is now holding that shape quietly while he determines what to do with it. "You found these in the writing cabinet," he said. "Behind the false panel in the lower section. The satchel was in good condition. The papers inside had not deteriorated. How long have you had them?" She told him the truth. 6 weeks, Your Grace." Something moved in his expression, and then was carefully still again. "Why did you wait?" "I needed to be certain they were what they appeared to be. I did not wish to bring you something I could not verify." She paused, and I was not immediately certain of how they would be received. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way Lady Constance looked at her, which was a look that placed and dismissed in a single motion, classifying before observing. He looked at her the way he looked at the estate ledgers, with a patient attention that suggested accuracy mattered, and carelessness was the thing to be afraid of. She had the distinct impression that he was not only considering the letters, but considering her, and that the consideration was not unkind. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He did not sit. He moved to the window and stood there for a moment with the letters in his hand, looking out at the north pasture. And she waited. He asked her 11 questions over the following hour, each one precise, each building on the last, each designed to establish not whether the evidence was real, but whether there was any possibility she had misread its significance. She answered every question as accurately as she could, and said plainly when she did not know something. She told him about the ledger entries, the amounts, the years. She told him the provision had been consistent across 8 years and had ended in the year of the late Duke's death. She told him that to the best of her knowledge as an archivist, she had found no evidence of any renewal, no correspondence with a solicitor about continued provision, no acknowledgement that the obligation had passed to anyone or been formally discharged. She told him she could be wrong. She did not believe she was wrong. He did not raise his voice. He did not thank her. When she rose to leave, he said, "I will need you to prepare a full formal account of the provenance. Everything you found and where you found it. In order. Witnessed by Mrs. Whitmore." "Yes, Your Grace." "Miss Graves." She had reached the door. "You could have destroyed these." "Yes," she said. "You did not." "No, Your Grace." He did not say anything further. She went back to the archive and sat down at her table and looked at the box she had been working through when the decision had first crystallized, and she picked up the next paper in it, and she began to read. The investigation did not announce itself as an investigation. Marian observed its progress indirectly, through the pattern of visitors to Aldenmere in the weeks that followed. A solicitor she had not seen before arrived on a Wednesday and stayed until Friday, closeted with the Duke and the Duke's secretary for long hours each day. She heard from Mrs. Whitmore's kitchen conversations that he had asked to see the household ledgers going back 20 years. A quiet gray-haired man arrived the following week, shown into the library and offered wine. Mrs. Whitmore said only that he was an old acquaintance of the household and that he had been at Aldenmere in the late Duke's time, which told Marian enough. A vicar from a village in Wiltshire came by post-chaise at the end of November, was met by the Duke personally at the front steps in weather that did not invite standing outside, and left 3 hours later with a sealed letter and an expression of a man who has been trusted with something that humbles him. She prepared her formal account of provenance and gave it to the Duke's secretary. She returned to the catalogue. She said nothing to anyone about what she had found or what she believed was being done about it, because it was not hers to say, and because the silence felt correct. Lady Constance said something to her. She said it at the household review in the second week of December, while the rest of the staff were organizing the correspondence schedule for the holiday fortnight. She said it quietly, which made it worse. And she said it without looking at Marian directly, which made it worse still. "I think we are perhaps at the natural end of your commission here, Miss Graves. The archive is substantially complete. I have written to my son to that effect." Marian looked at her notes. "You are, as I said at the outset, an excellent sort of woman for this kind of work," Lady Constance continued. Her voice was entirely composed. She had the particular poise of a woman who had managed this kind of household conversation many times and considered it a form of tidiness rather than unkindness. Quiet, thorough, appropriate. "I hope your reference from us will be of use in securing your next commission. The sort of woman for this kind of work." The third time, and the third setting, and the phrasing was so consistent that Marian almost found herself admiring it. The way one can admire the mechanism of a clock, even when it is being used to count down to something unpleasant. She said, "Thank you, my lady," and went back to the archive. She had 2 boxes left to catalog. She worked methodically through the first, found nothing of further significance, and was midway through the second when the door of the archive opened and the Duke came in. He came in himself, which he had not done before. Previously, if he wanted her, he sent a footman. He was wearing his riding coat, and his gloves were still in his hand, and he looked like a man who had come directly from the stables to this room without stopping at his study first, which told her something about the degree of urgency, or perhaps the degree of displeasure that had brought him here by the fastest route. "My mother has told you your commission is ending," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "She did not consult me before doing so." Marian set down the paper she had been cataloging. She waited. "I require the archive to be completed fully," he said. "This commission continues until it is complete, and that determination is mine to make." He looked at her steadily. "Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly required by the statement he had made. She had the impression, not for the first time, that he was saying more than the specific words. And she had the impression, not for the first time, that she understood the more, but was not going to name it first. "You have been working in a cold room for 8 weeks, he said. His voice had shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but less formal. "The cold does not trouble me particularly." "It troubles me," he said, as though this were a practical matter he had identified and intended to address. "I will have a second brazier brought in." He turned toward the door and then stopped, his hand not quite on the frame. "Miss Graves, the man in Wiltshire. His name is Thomas Stowe. He is 26 years old, and he is a schoolmaster. He has been a schoolmaster since he was 18. She did not ask whether the letters had been what they appeared to be. The answer was in his voice, which was the voice of a man who had confirmed something difficult, and was not going to pretend it was other than difficult. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He left. She sat for a long moment with her hands in her lap, looking at the second brazier that would arrive, and thinking about Thomas Stowe at 18, taking up a schoolmaster's position with no income behind him, no provision from a late Duke's ledger any longer, only whatever education that same provision had purchased in the years before it ended. She thought about what a schoolmaster earned in Wiltshire, and whether it was sufficient for a young man whose history had certain gaps in it. Then she picked up the next paper in the box, and she went back to work. The second brazier arrived within the hour. She thought about that very carefully indeed. Thomas Stowe came to Aldenmere in January on a gray afternoon that threatened snow and delivered on the threat within an hour of his arrival. Marian saw him from the archive window. He was a young man of middle height with an honest face and a plain brown coat that had been brushed recently but was not new, standing at the foot of the house steps and looking up at the facade with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself the first morning she had arrived. It was the expression of a person who is not certain they have any right to be here, and has decided, after considerable thought, that the uncertainty does not excuse them from coming. He looked up at the house for a long time before he went in. Marian turned back to her work. She was not present at the meeting between the Duke and the schoolmaster. She learned of it afterward, in the way she learned most things at Aldenmere, through what happened next. What happened next was that the solicitor returned and spent 2 full days, that Lady Constance was absent from the household review for the first time since Marian's arrival, and that a letter went out to the family's man of law in London on the third day, with a weight suggesting it contained considerably more than a single sheet. 3 days after Thomas Stowe's visit, the Duke came to the archive again. He sat in the chair across from her work table, which no one had ever sat in before because no one other than Marian had ever had cause to sit in it, and he looked at the shelves of catalogued boxes for a moment before he spoke. He knew something was irregular about his birth, he said. His mother had told him, before she died, that his father was a man of rank who had made provision for him to be educated. She told him this when she understood that she was dying, so that he would not be left without any explanation at all. He had accepted it as a closed question. A pause, not uncomfortable. He did not know about the letter. He did not know she had written. How did he receive it? With more grace than I expected. He is a quiet young man, steadier than I was at his age, I think, though I may not be the best judge of that. The Duke was looking at the shelves, and Marian had the impression he was seeing something other than shelves. He said he had always known there was something he was not being told, and that the not knowing had been the hardest part. Not the circumstance itself, but the silence around it. He paused again. He is not making a claim. Marian looked at him carefully. He may have the right to one. He may. The question is not entirely simple, legally. My mother's solicitor and my own are not in agreement about several aspects of it. Thomas himself has chosen not to pursue it. Something moved in the Duke's voice that was held very level. He has a school. He has pupils who depend upon him. He has a life he has built, with no assistance from anyone bearing his father's name, and he told me that he did not wish to dismantle that life for a legal campaign whose outcome is uncertain, and whose cost, he said, would not justify what it purchased. What did he want? To correspond. The Duke looked at her now. To have the connection acknowledged, to know that the letters existed, and that someone had read them. He was quiet for a moment. He asked whether his mother had seemed, in the letters, to be well. Marian felt something in her chest that required a moment to settle. She seemed, she said carefully, to be a woman of considerable dignity in difficult circumstances. The Duke received that. He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they are accepting something as the full truth rather than as a consolation. I have told him he is welcome at Aldenmere, he said. That whatever the law says, I know what the letters say, and I will not pretend otherwise. That if he wishes to visit, there is a room for him. That if there are costs connected to his school or to his circumstances that my estate can reasonably address, I am prepared to address them. He paused. I am aware that this does not repair 11 years. It is more than nothing, Marian said. It is a great deal more than nothing. He looked at her. The fire had settled to a steady warmth, and the room was quiet, and outside the first snow of January was making the light gray and soft, and she was aware, with a precision she had been managing for weeks, of exactly how near he was sitting, and exactly what the quality of his attention felt like when it was directed entirely at her. You could have left, he said. When my mother told you the commission was ending, you could have gone. It would have been considerably more comfortable. Yes, she said. I could have. Why didn't you? She thought about how to answer that, and she decided that the most honest answer was also the simplest one. Because the work was not finished. And because I did not think the question of what happened to Thomas Stowe was going to be resolved correctly unless someone stayed to see it through. I was not certain someone else would stay. You were not certain I would. I was not certain you knew enough of the details to know what staying through meant, she said, with a care that was not evasion. You knew more than I expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I had wondered, for some years, whether there was something in my father's history that was not being told. There was nothing specific. It was a pattern of avoided subjects, and a certain kind of silence in rooms when particular topics arose. I had decided, at some point, that wondering was not productive without evidence. He looked at her with a steadiness that had moved some distance from its usual formality. You brought me the evidence. I am an archivist, she said. It is what I do. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the very small indication of a man who had found something almost amused him in a situation that was not otherwise amusing, and it was, she thought, the closest thing to warmth she had seen him allow himself in her presence. It lasted only a moment. She had seen it. She finished the archive catalog 2 weeks later, the final box completed, the final provenance recorded, the final report drafted in her clearest hand, and delivered to the Duke's study on a Tuesday morning. She had spent a day on the covering letter, which was businesslike, and said precisely what needed to be said and no more. He read through the report in silence. He turned to the last page. He looked up. I understand you are to return to London, he said. I have a recommendation from your secretary and from Mrs. Whitmore. I expect to find another commission. Yes, he said. You would. He set the report down on the desk with more care than a completed report technically required. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking, rather than when he was withholding. And she had learned, over these weeks, to tell the difference. My mother has not made this house comfortable for you. Lady Constance has made her views clear. She is not wrong that I am a woman hired to perform a specific task, and the task is now done. She is wrong about a number of things, he said. His voice was even, but she could hear underneath the evenness something that had been accumulating, steadily, for some time. She is wrong about the value of the task. She is wrong about what made it valuable. She is wrong about why someone capable of doing it well is not someone to be dismissed the moment the filing is complete. He paused. And she is wrong about you, specifically. The fire was steady. The snow had not come today. The light through the north windows was pale and clear. Your Grace, she said. You could have destroyed those letters, he said. Every person in my household would have benefited from it, in the narrow sense. My mother's position would be undisturbed. The estate would proceed without complication. Thomas Stowe would continue to teach long division in Wiltshire and wonder, perhaps, why the provision that had educated him had stopped so abruptly the year he was 8, but he would have had no further information about it, and in time the wondering might have faded. He looked at her directly. You did not destroy them. I would like to understand why. She looked at him for a moment. There were many correct ways to answer this question, most of them professionally appropriate, and none of them entirely the truth. She chose the truth. Eleanor Stowe asked for almost nothing, she said. Across 4 letters, over 2 years, she asked for almost nothing. She asked for the provision to be kept, which it was. She asked for acknowledgement, which she did not receive. And at the end, she asked only that Thomas be told, when he was old enough, that his father was not ashamed of him. She paused. She received nothing. The provision ended when he was 8, and she asked for nothing after that. And it seemed to me that if there was a chance, 11 years on, to give something back that she should have been given, then someone in the room when that chance appeared ought to take it. She looked at him steadily. I was the someone in the room. He was very still. She had been right, all along, that his stillness was not coldness. It was a particular kind of discipline, the practice of a man who had managed a great deal alone for a long time and had learned to hold his face level across it, and who had just allowed considerably more of himself to be visible than he intended. Marian, he said. He said it once, carefully, her given name in his voice, as though he had been considering saying it for some time, and had decided that now was when it should be said. I would ask you not to go back to London. The fire had burned down to a steady warmth. Outside the study window, snow had begun, the slow, patient kind that settles without drama. Your Grace, she said. Frederick, he said. Under the circumstances. She looked at him for a long moment, in the quiet of the study with the snow beginning beyond the glass, and she understood what he was offering. It was not a further commission, not a formal proposal in the procedural sense, not a declaration anyone standing outside the door could confirm. It was something more fundamental than any of those things. It was a man who had been very careful for a very long time, deciding that Marian Graves was the person he did not want to be careful with, and that the decision was not one he intended to retract. Under the circumstances, she said, I believe I can stay a little longer. The snow continued. Lady Constance learned of the formal engagement 3 weeks later, in the dining room, at the end of a dinner at which Thomas Stowe was seated to Frederick's left, and Marian was 2 places down, and the arrangement of the table said everything the Duke had not yet said directly to his mother. Lady Constance's fan stilled in her hand. She looked once at Marian, once at her son, once at the schoolmaster who had arrived from Wiltshire with a quiet face and no claim, and something moved across her expression that Marian had not expected. It was not fury. It was a look she had not seen from Lady Constance before. It was a look that was beginning, slowly and with visible reluctance, to understand that the hierarchy she had managed for 30 years was not the only measure of value in a room. Frederick said, his voice entirely level. Miss Graves has agreed to be my wife. I expect the household to receive that news appropriately. He paused. She found the letters in this house's archive that told us Thomas existed, and she brought them to me when she could have done otherwise. That is the kind of person she is. I am asking you to know that. The room was very quiet for 3 seconds. Then Mrs. Whitmore, seated beside the vicar at the far end of the table, began to applaud, and the guests followed in the way that guests always follow the one person in a room who is not watching anyone else for permission. Lady Constance set her fan on the tablecloth. She did not applaud. She did not leave. She sat with the particular dignity of a woman who is wrong and knows it, and has decided, in this moment, not to be also small. Marian thought it was perhaps the most she could reasonably ask for. Thomas Stowe looked at his brother, and then he looked at Marian, and he smiled. In the way people smile when something long wrong is being made less wrong. Which is not a triumphant smile and not a vindicated one, but something quieter and more sustaining than either. Frederick did not look at Marian across the table. He looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has done the correct thing and is not going to perform it. Then he reached for his glass, and the dinner continued. The wedding was held in February at the parish church in the village below the estate, with a congregation of 14 people and snow on the churchyard stones, and the vicar from Wiltshire reading the service in a voice that carried the warmth of a man who understood what he was witnessing and found it sufficient reason to read carefully. Thomas Stowe stood at the back of the church with his hands folded and his face open in the way that faces are when they are feeling something they had not expected to be allowed to feel. Marian wore her best dress, which was cream-colored and had been let out at the waist by Mrs. Whitmore, who had come to her room the evening before with a needle and thread, and had said, without any preamble at all, "You did a good thing, miss. A great many people would not have." She had said it the way people say true things, which is quickly and without flourish, and while doing something else with their hands, and then she had threaded the needle and begun to work on the hem. The archive room was given to Marian after the wedding as a study, to use as she chose, and she chose to use it as such. She continued to catalog. There was always more to catalog. The false panel in the writing cabinet had been repaired, but not sealed, at her suggestion, because she thought it was important to remember that the space had existed. Frederick agreed with her on this point without needing to be persuaded, which she thought said something accurate about him. In April, a letter arrived from Thomas Stowe in Wiltshire, addressed to both of them in a careful, clear hand, reporting on the progress of the school term and the difficulty of teaching long division to boys who would rather be outside, and asking after the estate with a naturalness that suggested he had been practicing the naturalness until it was real. At the end, in a somewhat different hand, as though he had set the letter down and come back to it after some hours, he had written simply, "I am glad the letter was not destroyed. I am glad you are who you are, Miss Graves, that was. I thought you ought to know. If your heart has stayed until the end of this story, perhaps leave a word in the quiet below." Marian Graves did not expect to be seen, and she could not have known that the seeing would matter as much as it did. Marian read the letter twice, then set it on the desk beside the others, in the place where the important documents were kept, in the order in which they had arrived. The window looked east, toward the village, and beyond it the Wiltshire Road, and beyond that a schoolroom full of boys being taught long division by a man who had been told his father was not ashamed of him, which was not the same as being told his father had loved him, but was, it turned out, enough to begin with. Outside, the first green of the English April was coming in across the estate grounds, the particular clear green that does not happen anywhere else, and it was coming in steadily, covering the fields and the old stone walls without asking anyone's permission, which was the way the best things generally arrived. She picked up the pen, and she began her reply.